An experimental session, and thank you very much for being part of it. I'm going to do a very brief bit of housekeeping, and then Jose is going to talk briefly about the Earth Hub, and then we'll get into the exciting zero carbon amendment bill. That sends a shiver down the spine, doesn't it? So the housekeeping is, first of all, thanks. You know the story. If we get an earthquake and all the rest of it, you drop, cover and hold. You can get out there, you can get out where you came in over there. That door's unlocked, so toilets are in here. Oh, thank you. Demonstration, yeah. Do help yourself to drink a cup of tea, coffee or biscuit or anything. Anyway, first of all, it's a real thrill. This is one of the first events of this type to be held in the Earth Hub. And I mean, somebody said it's a bit like a church and all the rest of it, and it is, isn't it, in several ways. But until recently it was the Chapel Cafe. But by coincidence, it's been converted into a climate centre for a community at exactly the time we were looking for an event. And that was a wonderful little bit of serendipity. But I'd like to pass over to Jose Cano, who owns this and is doing the wonderful work on it. So Jose, a real pleasure and thank you.
Thank you and welcome everybody to the, I say Earth Hub because I speak in Spanish. If somebody needs translation, please let me know. So it's the Earth Hub. And yeah, that we restored this space that was gonna put down and create and make another car yard, but fortunately we stopped it before and we keep it in the same. So now it's a community space for anything that is sharing knowledge and action about climate change. So the Earth Hub, that is this space, this is the website, by the way, that I'm going, and you can see already, which one is it? What is the purpose of the Earth Hub? We want to respond to the climate emergency that we are. We don't want to be just talking, we want to really that the community knows and act on the crisis that we are. And because we cannot treat climate change without talking about the economy that has created, we also promote circular economy. So any person, any group, any organization that want to come and use this space to talk and promote these two goals are very welcome here. So here what we do is, so it's not my laptop, so we do talks in this place for anybody to feel free to come. No? Monica, that is at the end, and myself, we are both trained by Al Gore in the Climate Reality Project. So we are preparing not only talks about climate change in general, but we have a program for a school. We have even done a talk to 6-year-old children about climate change. And they're the most receptive, amazing crowd that you can give a talk. And of course, we have Lindsay with ZCAB that is fantastic. He's starting this communicating effort here. And Ocean Stories, we just talk about climate change and the ocean. So this is the 3 talks that we have started. And anybody that wants or knows somebody that is interested, this is the place. Bring it, let's talk. Let's share knowledge in this space. This place is also open for meetings. So 350 is already meeting here, Extinction Rebellion, ACE, Nelson Can, the Organic COP. This is a space from community dinners and winter solstice, or just get together and be with people, not just with laptops or mobile phones, real people talking to each other. That's what we want. No? We have also a library of climate change and progressive economy that anybody, if they go to the website and click there,
Sorry, it's not a Mac, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, it's not my computer. You can go online from your home and check all the books that we have just on climate change communication, or progressive economy, and you can come here, read it or borrow it. Now I have to come back from your computer. If you, sorry, this is not my computer. Can you tell me how to get out of this page and come back from to my website? So
Probably not.
So basically, this is a space to share knowledge, but also to act on climate change. Right? Here.
We're a good team, aren't we?
This one, fantastic.
No, it's not.
No,
No.
this one. Okay.
Do-
Anyway, that was all the website. You can go.
That's not, you want more on your website.
There
don't you?
is not much more in the website.
Okay.
Just to let you know that our website is alive, that you can see these things that we do, that this is a community space to share knowledge, and you are all welcome, not just to come, but to bring knowledge here and share it with everybody. So thank you for being here today.
I think it's a fantastic initiative, and it's just a thrill to be a part of the start of it. And I didn't pick up, maybe Jose said at the end while I see that you can drop in and have a coffee and read a book and things too. It's really cool. Anyway, we're going to get going now. Can I just ask how many people were hoping to go online here today? I know some people have brought laptops or notepads, and quite a few people haven't. So just hands up, please. Just one or two. Okay, well, we'll give you a login and when we get to that point. Thank you. Also, can I just have a show of hands? How many people have actually tried or started or prepared a submission for the Zero Carbon Amendment Bill so far? Okay, 1, 2. Okay, that's great. So we've actually got a pretty clean slate. Fantastic. No, but that's good, because it means that you haven't got so far in that you'll pick up all the mistakes I'll make. So it really is. Now, just to tell you a little bit about me, I'm Lindsay Wood. When people say what you specialize in, I say I specialize in being a generalist. And that means that I try to join the dots between a whole lot of fields, and I work a lot between the science and technology and the communication of it, the advocacy to council. I do quite a lot of reports. I do talks like this and articles for stuff and things like that. And something I should have said at the beginning is that this is being recorded and streamed, but it's not live streamed. But I just want to let you know that it's possible that an edited version will go on a website or something like that. So be cautious what you say if you're worried about that. Okay, thank you. This is workshop 1. We have a whole lot of ideas where we're going. ACE really came about because we were concerned that we didn't want to look back in 4 months and say to Nelson City Council, what have you been doing? We wanted to be part of that journey, and I'm a real believer in trying to support councils to be good councils. But there's bits of paper around that'll tell you a little bit more about ACE if you want to. Okay, so how will this work today? We're going to spend about half an hour on a presentation to you, just a little bit about the Zero Carbon Bill. Essentially a bit of context, both for climate, which you perhaps know, some of you, and also about the bill itself. And then a little discussion on the 4 main areas that the bill focuses on. And then we'll go into workshop mode, hopefully for about an hour. I can't guarantee we're going to finish on the dot of 7, and it's going to be ambitious for people to actually get submissions in, but because most of you have come without online stuff, it means that you're perhaps not expecting that anyway. Okay, so let's get into it. That's a slide basically drawn from the IPCC special report that came out late last year. IPCC is an intergovernmental panel to do under United Nations. That's one of the leading sort of think tank groups about climate change. The thing is that we've basically been tracking up here for a couple of 100 years, and what they're really saying is that we have to get to 1.5 degrees warming to control it to that and keep ourselves in, we can't say safe territory, but less calamitous territory. We have to try and decarbonize by 2050. So that's, if you like, the genesis of part of the bill that we're now talking about. And the thing about that is that New Zealand, it was one of the first national pieces of legislation to try and tackle that. They also have a 2-degree target in the IPCC report, but that's less ambitious, and so I think it's great that we're going for the more ambitious one. In case you think that's the nice thing about coloured pictures and nice graphs and so on. Let's not forget that this is a terribly serious situation we're dealing with. And apologies if I sound like I'm dramatising stuff. It's a report done for the security services in Australia. Now, they're not given to tree-hugging, greeny sort of rhetoric and things, so just have a look. They say it's an existential threat. Greenhouse gases are now greater on the Earth warmer than humanity has ever experienced. So we're now living in a climate that is completely alien to 70, 80, 90,000 years of human history. So, and the other things they say, they comment on how science is chronically underreported for various reasons, among others, psychology of dealing with existential threats. And policymakers have hugely failed to envisage what's at stake. And finally, they're saying we may need martial law to get industry to decarbonise fast enough. So that's a report. It's not actually by the Australian Security Services, but it was written in that arena. Okay, I hope it doesn't get any worse than that from here. I'm saying to you, I think Greta Thunberg's talk to the COP24 is the most important 3 minutes in human history. You know, I'm sorry, Martin Luther King, eat your heart out. But if you haven't seen that, then I really urge you to. I mean, I was in tears when I saw it. I nearly am now at the thought of it. And I'll tell you a little bit why. Okay, the history of climate emergencies is that they started in Australia about 3 years ago, early 2016, and they chugged along a few places, and then it suddenly took off. And see what happened there. That's when she gave her address. Now, I'm not saying she was the only catalyst for that, but it's certainly a correlation, isn't there, between when she gave her address and suddenly this global explosion of interest in it. But just out of interest, to put it a bit more in scale in our context, if you see the pink line up on the top right there, that's where Nelson declared its climate emergency, along with the Canterbury Regional Council. We were the first in New Zealand on the same day. Within a month, and up to the 14th of June, half of the whole of New Zealand's population fell underneath a climate emergency. And that's got bigger since then. Wellington, for example, has declared, and I'm not sure whether Hawke's Bay has or not. Somebody might know. But the other thing is, in the same period, there's been a 44% increase globally just in that once. So that gives you a feeling for the trajectory that this is on. Sometimes they're whole countries, sometimes they're cities. Apologies to, I know there are people from Nelson Council here. Some of you have seen this before. I gave a paper a couple of years ago at a Climate and Cities conference in Berlin, and my paper was a case study of how cities struggle to actually put aspirational policies into good action plans. And because I knew Nelson, I reported on Nelson. Now, I'm not singling Nelson out here. I want to say that you could have done this about almost any council anywhere in the world, and it would be the same. Oh, yes, we're going to really do well, and then we don't actually put it into the plans. And oh, we really have to do well, and then we don't put it in the plans. A couple of years ago, there was a declaration came out of the Mayor's Convention in Auckland, and that was a bit of a milestone. I'm sorry, we won't worry about what's down there, but I think the thing that's really the big milestone deserves a big thumbs up is not only that Nelson declared its emergency, but then it allocated very serious funding to it. And that is the make or break to me between aspirational policy and actually having a chance of doing something. And that was one of the spurs, you know, at the ACE group, we were on the road partly to try and help that process along. What we're trying to address. Some of you will know this is a graph taken from what's known as the greenhouse gas inventory, which the Ministry for the Environment has to do on a regular basis as part of our involvement in the international effort. So what it does, if you imagine the red line is at 0, and the three big things there, the three big panels of colour, are the three main components of the national emissions profile. The one on the left there is forestry, and the other LUs come for land use and land use change. You don't need to worry too much about that. From our point of view, what that's saying is our forests suck up a lot of carbon out of the air, and that's good. Agriculture there, if you can read that, says 48% of our emissions are from ag, 41% are from energy, and then the balance, we won't spend time on them, but you can read there if you want. But just a few comments to make about them. Forestry is critical. It's the only thing we've got at the moment that really sucks carbon out of the air. I mean, when I say the only thing, plants do generally, obviously, but forestry in terms of accounting. But two things are, it's temporary. Trees don't last forever. We might think that's great, we've got trees and they grow for 50 years or 80 years. But ultimately there comes a time when they stop storing carbon, or they get blown down, or they're more prone to fires. And the other thing is, and this is quite a big deal, and I've highlighted in pinky red there, things that I think are particularly worth our while to factor in today. And that is that the previous emissions trading scheme, which was in the 90s and proved to be a disaster, didn't distinguish between a farmer that just chopped down all their trees and left them to rot, and a farmer that milled their trees, or a forester, milled them and sent them off to be put into furniture or into a building or something. It's really important that we cross that bridge this time and give a real incentive to people to get these trees and then get them into a downstream process where they're going to be stored. They won't be stored forever, but in a building another 50 or 100 years is a very valuable slot of time in the climate arena. If we now go from there into these two, agriculture is the biggest, not by a huge margin, but it's 48%, and methane is contentious, as we'll talk about a bit more, but I'm sure most of you know that anyway. Methane basically comes from cow burps, also sheep burps. We'll talk more about it, but it's 75% of that green block there. The emissions that agriculture makes come from methane. That's an approximate figure, but that's the order of it. If we go to energy, which is a bit smaller, but it contains transport, which is the fastest growing of all the emissions things. So what we've got with energy is we've got a big hit of stuff going up, more cars, more industrial processes and so on. And so what the Zero Carbon Amendment Bill says is that by 2050, all emissions have to be net zero. That is, by the time you've factored in the ones that we add and the ones that forests take away, have to come down to zero, except for biogenic methane. That's the stuff from agriculture, which has got special considerations, and we'll talk more about that. Just to be clear, biogenic methane is used as a term to distinguish it from methane that comes from things like mineral extraction. So coal mines release methane, as we know, for example, from the horrors of the Pike River explosions and so on. But they are a different category, and they have to be cut to zero as well. But the agricultural ones have got a special exemption. So the origins of the Zero Carbon Amendment Bill, I'm going to ask Jenny here to just talk briefly about that. Jenny Easton's one of the ACE group, and give you a break from my voice and also let you hear from someone who knows more about it than I do.
I think the dates are actually really important because it was in June 2018 that New Zealand's discussion document for the Zero Carbon Act and the public submissions for net zero by 2050. But as Lindsay was saying, that and later on in that year was when the IPCC report came out for 1.5, and so telling us we've only got 12 years to cut emissions in half to have a chance of I've got the microphones. So what we all submitted on then was actually, we didn't know how important 1.5 was, and now in May 2019 the Zero Carbon Act Amendment Bill has come out and according for public submissions. Well, it hasn't come from nowhere because 10 years ago, in 2008, the United Kingdom adopted this, made their Zero Carbon Act, and they had an amazing level of, high level of cross-party support. 463% yes, and only 3 said no. It was really quite phenomenal. It was actually Maggie Thatcher. I mean, she was a chemist before she was a warmonger and so and so. But anyway, so she knew, her chemistry told her that climate change was real. And later on, Tony Blair, who was also a anti-black, he actually spoke very strongly in the European EU about it. So they got off, so 10 years ago, they got going. And the Stern report had come out 2 years before that, and that had said what a huge cost it was going to be if we did nothing. And it was less expensive to start early and mitigate and prepare for climate change. The 4 key things that they put in the legislation is exactly what we've copied. So targets in the legislation, carbon budgets are stepping stones to get to the target. Policies are set by the government, who we elect and can vote out if we don't like it. And the expert body, which is stakeholders, they give the advice and analyse, but they don't regulate. So we use the same formula. And the idea is that they set carbon budgets well in advance, because that gives certainty to investors, to industry, entrepreneurs, and it also prevents stranded assets, people spending money on stuff that's not going to be any good later. Now, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, she credited Generation Zero, the young Gen Zero people, for pushing the government into setting up our own ZCAB, our Zero Carbon Act, based on the UK model. And in 2017, when she wrote the report, there are at least 9 countries who had similar acts. And what has happened in America and Canada and Australia, where their governments aren't so good, there's actually 12 states there or provinces that have drawn up the same sorts of acts. Now, the other PCE, Simon Upton, he wrote a report in 2018, and he said the main problem in the UK has been implementation, and it's the classic short-term government trying to, or not, pass policies and regulations for long-term challenges that they themselves won't have to endure. So it's a problem that we're going to have to tackle too. For example, the UK has not met their 4th budget, and they probably won't meet their 5th one either, because they've gone and passed laws to enable fracking, and the whole of the 4 things they've done which are going to make it really hard for them to reach that. And they haven't been taken to court, and Simon Upton said that's probably because a court of law will say, well, elected MPs are allowed to do that. So what he suggested is that we tighten up the timetable for the reports and statements, and require every policy government or department passes to be viewed through a climate change lens and report quite transparently on those. That's what he said. Now, just lastly, it's actually interesting, I looked through what the public submissions have been for the Zero Carbon Act. I'm sure most of you did that in. And 90% of them wanted net zero 2050 legislation across all gases and only using domestic productions. Most submissions agreed with 5-yearly budgets. We've actually got all 3. And 96% agreed that the Climate Change Commission should be independent and experts, not stakeholders, and not regulatory. 84% said the climate change should just advise the ETS, not actually regulate it. And 92 said that the Zero Carbon Act should include adaptation. So it's interesting to see that it's roughly what we asked for, but just with this new piece of knowledge that we've got, I think we have to amend the Act and ask for a 2030
Okay.
target.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, everybody. And Jenny, there might be some terms in there that you're not familiar with. Some of them will become clear, but if you want to ask questions, that's fine. I do have 2 little questions, though. One is, how's everybody for warmth? Does anybody need more air? No, you're okay. I also am going to put round a thing for people to put their names down if they want to go on the mailing list, either for future ACE events or for Climate Matters, which is a little promotion here. About every fortnight I put out a 1-page newsletter, which a lot of you will get anyway. If we've got your email address through your booking here, just put a tick in the email address thing, as long as you put your name on the left side and tick whichever box you want. They just pass that around. Thanks. So moving on then, as Jenny said, the 4 key elements of the Zero Carbon Amendment Bill, and I'll just say it's called that because last year, you may remember, it came out as the Zero Carbon Bill. There is a legislation called the Climate Change Response Act, which was put in 2002, and the government's advice was it would be better to make this new legislation sit underneath that. Otherwise, you have to do all the rejigging of all the legislation to make them work together. So it's now called that's the short name, the Zero Carbon Amendment Bill. It's got a longer name to do with the parent one. Anyway, So the first thing is emissions reduction targets and dates. That's one of the key areas. The second one is a series of budgets or stepping stones. The third one is the government must develop and implement climate policy. In other words, it obliges the government to do stuff. And then the final one is the Climate Change Commission, which Jenny just spoke briefly of. And I'll touch on those in a bit of now. Some of you will think, oh my God, I can't follow this. Don't worry if you can't, but for those that can, I just wanted to go through it. That's the same curve that I put on the first slide. Just saying that's from the IPCC. And here's how the budgets work, okay? So at this stage here, so there's 2020, so pretty soon the government will have to propose 3 emissions targets. And they are progressively getting smaller. And they relate to those figures I showed up earlier, the black and the green and the blue. But basically say this is how much emissions we're allowed to have in New Zealand this year. And they have to project it 3 5-year periods ahead. But the first one is almost absolute and is not flexible. The others can be subject to a little bit of adjustment, but not much. Now, that's really important because what that means is that this government is projecting for, say, 5 elections ahead. So we get a change in government and they can't suddenly say, whoop, out with all of that. We're going to do something different. It's very much about stabilizing the difference between party politics, but it's not completely immune to that, and neither should it be. So then what happens is the next budget comes in and they fix the next 5 years, and then there's another 5 years tacked on the end, and they don't have to exactly match. So there might be oh, hang on, we're not quite ambitious enough here, we'll pull it down again, but still projecting 3 steps ahead. And then the same thing happens again and again. And the idea is that progressively, I mean, it looks easy there, doesn't it? But we get down to this, this destination of 0 emissions and 0 net emissions in 2050. So have you got the general feeling? So each time the next 5 years is fixed, but then the 2 lots of 5 years after that are serious, but they're not immutable. The history of climate change response is a dismal failure, high aspirations and low success. And this picks up on what Jenny said, but for a different reason. I think one of the problems is that we say, oh, we're going to get to 2050. And all history tells us is that we're not going to get there because we're not very good at implementing these things. So one of the real things is whether we should be aiming for 2030, 2035 or whatever. My own view is that we should definitely be targeting that, even if it's just for prudent project management, because we're going to have slippage, and that gives us a bit more breathing space, because it's very, very serious if we don't get there. There are several other things that go with that to do with, you know, we don't know what's ahead. There's a lot of uncertainty. Also, it's fantastic to have role models, and even little Nelson, one of the smallest cities in the country, declaring a climate emergency. I've heard from other areas that in fact there is that's given a lift to other areas, and little old New Zealand, one of the world's most remote economies, potentially can do the same in small areas. Okay, those that like headache stuff, here we go. This is my attempt to explain to you what the story is about methane. It's very contentious, and essentially it focuses very strongly on the agricultural sector, especially the dairy sector, but not only it. Okay. I want you to imagine this red line here is some carbon dioxide that's in the air, okay? And the height of the line is important because it tells us an idea of the measure of how much carbon dioxide. When it gets to that point, the end of the first arrow, one of 2 things can happen. In fact, more, but I'm going to talk about 2. One is it can keep going as carbon dioxide in the air, which is that pinkish bar there. Or it can go into a plant and into a cow, and the cow can burp out methane. Now, the methane that comes from the same carbon in that generates this much warming. So that's how much warming there is if it just stays in the air. And suddenly a cow burps what they call a pulse, and that's the effect it has. And look, we're talking of a 100-year time frame there. So within the first 20 years, it's a spectacular hit on the global warming. This is a measure of the warming potential. So one of the big things is if you have cows that, if you don't put it through a cow or through another ruminant, but I'm talking about cows mostly, then you don't get that huge methane hit, okay? The other lines, don't worry about the other dotted lines there, because I borrowed this graph from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment and I've just hybridized it a bit. So if you can just remember that the same amount of carbon dioxide is either producing a massive hit of methane or continuing in some other form. In actual fact, if it goes into a tree, you don't even get that pink bar. It goes right down. It's soaked up in the tree, and then it might re-emerge in 50 years or 80 years or whatever. So in a way, the pink bar is the worst scenario. There are a couple of other complications that I won't go into. So headache number one, that's the worst of it. The next bit is the same sort of thing, and it bears very strongly on the position that agriculture is taking. And I have to say, I'm someone that thinks that in some ways farmers have had a worse press than they deserve, so I'm not anti-farming. But this is a really important issue. Okay, what this is, a guy called Andy Reisinger, who is one of the leading scientists in the methane debate, basically prepared the black information there. Sorry, not that bit there, but the rest. If you suddenly put in a herd of cattle there, you suddenly bring 100 cattle, then over the next 20 or 30 years, all the methane from them builds up in the air. But if you only have the same 100 cattle, if that's all you ever have, then there comes a point where the methane that they're burping out is counteracted by the natural decay of the methane in the air, and it reverts to carbon dioxide and goes back into the plants and so on. So what they call the short carbon cycle, from science you may remember it as going into a tree and being respired back into the air, but if it goes through the cow, it goes through that big methane hit first. So the point, a lot of the agricultural argument is, hey, hang on, if we keep our stock numbers the same, then we're not making it any worse. That's a level line up there. But this is what happens if you do reduce your stock numbers. Suddenly, you get quite a rapid reduction in the methane in the air. So one of the big, and if you look at the things that the Federated Farmers have written, they talk about stabilizing the atmospheric methane. They don't talk about reducing it. And so that's a key part of that discussion. Thank you. We'll move on. So just to try and summarize, CH4, methane, has a dramatic eating hit. Changes in ruminant numbers dramatically pull down or lift up if it goes the other way. They're the targets, those are the targets for methane in the bill. Now, as I said, everything else comes down to net zero, but there are a lot of concessions for agricultural methane there. And you see, even in 2050, they're still only talking about halfway at the worst. The emissions trading scheme, initially agriculture is 95% exempt. So in addition to not having to reach 100% reduction, they actually get some quite big concessions. Now, I have to be honest, I'm not really familiar with that bit of it. I haven't got my head right in that space. So I don't want to be quoted too much on that, but the gist of it is correct. Intensive dairy also emits high nitrous oxide. Another bad greenhouse gas is nitrous oxide. We're not going to spend time on it, except to know that in intensifying dairy, there's been a lot of additional nitrogenous fertilizer put on the land to grow more grass for more cows to eat. And a lot of that has resulted in a big spike in another greenhouse gas as well. But that one does have to come down to zero by 2050. Here are two more things. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on that. Global warming potential 100 is how much a particular greenhouse gas heats in comparison to the same weight of carbon dioxide in 100 years. I'm sorry, this is sort of getting into the eye-glazing stuff. Scientists, including a guy called Dave Frame, who's got Nelson connections and is a professor at Victoria, have come up with another system which models the actual behavior of methane, that up and down business, more accurately. And there's a contention around which model we should be using. One of the things to know is the GWP 100 is the international thing embedded in the IPCC documents. So even if the other one is scientifically more accurate, we would be divorcing ourselves from the international community on this if we adopted it. However, just to keep the complication going, New Zealand is one of the lowest emitting dairy producers in the world. On average, a glass of milk made from New Zealand cows has about a third the emissions associated with a glass of milk in Europe. And so although we might think, oh God, this is all a big hit, the flip side is globally we're actually doing really well, partly thanks to the high level of research here, partly thanks to the fact that it's largely pastoral. But the thing is that then we have to ask ourselves, if we cut down say we said to the dairy sector, sorry, you've got to halve what you're doing. If that means that China or somewhere is going to start buying their milk products from somewhere that creates more emissions, we're not really helping the problem. So it's not simple, I'm sorry. We've talked about should we be stabilizing it or reducing it, and then a final complication is that the cross-party support for a zero carbon legislation is absolutely critical. That's one of the reasons it was delayed. It was meant to come out at the end of last year and it didn't. And the thing that was delaying it was they were waiting and waiting to get buy-in from all of them, all of the parties. And so the other thing there is if we suddenly say, oh, you've got to do this and you've got to do that and we'll set the bar higher everywhere, if that undermines the cross-party support, then we're worse off than we are at the moment. So, we're jumping now. The emissions trading scheme, as I said, I'm not a specialist in this.
Lindsay, is this part of the carbon bill? Is this part of the zero carbon bill or is it separate legislation?
Good question. It's a bit of both. It's enshrined. I mentioned that the zero carbon bill comes under the Climate Change Response Act, and that set in place an emissions trading scheme, but the zero carbon bill modifies that because that didn't work well. Very quickly, what the previous one did, it incentivized a whole lot of people to plant trees because there was this great prospect of a good carbon price. But then people were allowed to buy carbon in places like Ukraine and everywhere at a fraction of the price. And so suddenly this great boom went to bust in a short time. And they can't afford to repeat that. So does that answer your question enough there? So the question is, we're sitting on around about $25 a tonne of carbon dioxide. If you click the offsets button when you're buying a flight, that's about what you'll be charged for it. Not exactly, but close to that. There is talk about whether the cap is there for another couple of years, whether it should suddenly leap up to $75 a tonne. There is talk of it possibly rising to $250 a tonne. The point about this is that every time it goes up, it makes things like your petrol dearer, or whatever else you buy with an emissions component is going to get pricing. So the idea is that the price goes up. You can imagine if you're importing petrol cars and people suddenly think, oh my God, I'm paying another $1 a litre on gas. You're not going to be so keen to buy a petrol car. Is the interim exemption for agriculture okay? Now, I'm not familiar enough with the operational side of that to pass a comment, except that I think it's a question that should be asked. Are we confident it will work this time? Okay, it was a dismal failure last time. It was actually pioneering stuff in the world when it happened, and then it fell to pieces. And so the question is, there's a lot of reliance being put on the emissions trading scheme. I can't put an exact figure, but I would think 75 or 80% of all of this plan to get down to 2050 is meant to be driven by the ETS. And if anybody wants a bit of light reading, last year the Productivity Commission did a report on this, which sits at 600 pages, and that will basically outline how that's meant to work. How will it include harvested wood products? I've mentioned that before. There has to be a strategy, A, for recognising it for foresters, so that when they're planting trees, they're motivated to keep that wood from going into the ground and either burning it, because then it's straight up the carbon dioxide, or rotting more slowly, but then it generates methane, and that's also a baddie. How does it work on an international basis? I mentioned before the fact that we're sticking with that GWP 100, which is an international measure or not, and also if we have carbon prices that are right out of kilter with what's happening elsewhere in the world, we've got a different sort of problem. and what they call leakage. And leakage is where people, like, I don't know, you pay for your cloud storage, and you're paying, depending on where the cloud storage is, it might be a horribly emitting data storage center in China or whatever. So, or it might be an Iceland one. And will it make New Zealand uncompetitive? I don't think we can dwell more on that. Do you want to have a brief breather now, or shall I just keep going? We're nearly at the end of this round of the slides. Keep going. The Climate Change Commission. There are lots of commissions. You know, there's the Productivity Commission. The Reserve Bank, in a way, is governed by a commission. Some of them have decision-making powers, and some of them are an advisory capacity. So the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment has an advisory capacity to government, and that's the proposal here, is that this, in the way it is in the Act, that this commission can't actually say that's what the emissions target will be. They say, this is government, what we recommend the emissions target is, and then there are controls how it's put in place. So, no decision making. It's made up of 7 independent experts, not stakeholders. Now, Jenny highlighted that as well. And that's a really important thing. So, for example, a lot of industry would say, oh, we think we should have a representative there. Federated Farmers would, for example. But the strong experience overseas and the feeling here, and as Jenny said, a lot of the submissions last year said, we don't want it to be stakeholders. We want to have experts who can talk to stakeholders. It doesn't stop people like you and me and somebody growing daffodils from having a say in it. But the next thing is that the way it is appointed is that a special committee recommends to the minister, who then recommends to the Governor-General. So, in other words, the minister still appoints the people on the Climate Commission, but it's a very slow turnover, so they can only turn over 2 of their 7 members in any one year. But if we think what's happening to the judiciary in the US at the moment, I think you know about the presidential appointments to the judiciary, there is a little element of that risk here. I'm not saying it's that big, but there's a little bit of that. The Climate Change Commission has very wide terms of reference, but as far as I can see, they are not at liberty to say to the government, you have to consider this. If they see something from the left outfield and say, we really think you should take board of that, the government is entitled to say, no, that's outside your terms of reference. I think that's a gap in there. I believe there's a lot of transparency in the legislation. I think it's really good the way it's proposed. There are a lot of complicated time cycles. We've talked about the 5-yearly things of the emissions budgets. There's another one that goes 6 + 2 + 1, and there's another one that goes 2 + 12 weeks. And suddenly you've got all these cycles for different things going on, and I'm concerned that in an era when a lot of the discussion is about that we need agility and we need nimbleness in government because we don't know how quickly these things are coming at us and we don't know what we're going to deal with, that we don't have that. So I'm personally going to put in a plug for more agility. 4. Okay, now let's see. So the story now is that you've listened well, thank you. You're welcome to stop and get a drink. If there are any questions on what I've been saying, I'll do my best to answer them. But I also, at this point, thought we'd move into workshop mode. I didn't know how many people were bringing notebooks and the like. And so we've got tables here. And if you want to sit around and we can, there's a group of us. I'm not on my own here. We've got Peter here. You've met Jenny. There's Bruce. Where's Bruce? Is at the back. We'll walk around and try and help you through this if you want to ask questions. But does anybody have any questions right now? Yeah, Bruce. Barry, sorry. No, Barry, go for it.
Population growth. Nelson, New Zealand, and the world. Where does population growth fit into this? Because to me, it's one of the key things driving this, and it's not even the words aren't even clear.
I think that's a really good point. Population growth very often overwhelms all the best efforts to reduce emissions around the world. It's almost like a self-contradiction. The zero carbon bill doesn't make any reference to population growth that I've seen. And therefore, thank you for that. One of the things is, should we actually say, hey, what about developing a growth policy or a non-growth policy? you'll all know that that's really like a lightning rod for economists. Well, if we don't have growth, we're going to stagnate. But my belief is we have to be clever enough at thinking how we get prosperity without growth. I've seen one or two people waving bits of paper and things. Would you like another window open, anybody? Okay, could we just have one more window open? John?
Yes,
Just hang on, Mo Barry.
I was going to ask, from your study of the bill and the submission process, I think it's really helpful when you identify for us sort of points of where we can profitably put in a stick and stir, and it seems that you've already identified that the Commission should be able to identify gaps and complications that aren't foreseeable now. That's easy for us to say too if we hear that that's a problem. As far as population goes, the problem is that it takes a minimum of 30 years for that to even start working, right? And then you've got the chaos potential of refugees and people moving countries, which sort of makes the whole thing impossible to determine at a national level like us, a big empty country. I've certainly seen scientific studies that say our population is going to be 50 million by the end of the century, because that's all the people that are going to come here. What you do without passports, without anything else, because they're trying to keep their kids alive. So they won't be too much. That sort of thing.
Can I pick, that leads into an interesting thing, if I can just talk about, and I didn't comment before, but one of the issues that crops up, exactly in what John's saying, is how far do we just look at New Zealand's emissions profile and say, oh, we don't want to do anything that stops us getting to our target, so we don't want more people here because they might cause that problem? And how much do we say, oh, well, actually, it's a global problem? You know, I was saying before about the dairy thing. I've talked about that. Look, if we cut down our dairy, which is relatively low emissions, and it just leads to somebody else with more emissions producing more, then that doesn't work on a global sense. But on paper, it helps our accounting look better. And it's a bit the same, isn't it? Barry, you had a supplementary question.
Sort of, kind of, because another thing that hasn't appeared up there, or I've never seen part of these emissions standards of what's going to happen to the climate. In 1 or 2 years, it's fairly well accepted there'll be another major global financial and economic crash. What does that do to all this?
Yeah, I'm going to repeat the question, partly because I'm being recorded and it may not have come through. The question was, if we're rolling into another serious financial crash, what does that do to all of this? Makes it a devil of a lot harder, and there are provisions in there for things like exceptional circumstances, and I think you'd find that would trigger some of the rights under the Act for, I'm not saying it's a good thing, and climate's not going to stop because of it, although the last GFC, you'll find that all the emissions in most of the world dropped a bit at that time because everybody stopped making and buying stuff. So from an emissions point of view, a financial recession was a jolly good thing. But in terms of your ability to I don't know, convert from petrol vehicles to electric vehicles or whatever, it's a different thing again. Any other questions, Adrian?
Yeah, what's the time frame for putting in a submission?
16th, thank you, 16th of July. I'm going to put a couple of other little things up there. I was just giving a brief pause there. We're including, as John said, some perhaps areas to talk about. But 16th of July, there are 2 or 3 ways which I'll cover off there. So we've got 3 weeks, barely. Peter.
So I was just wondering if you could comment on strategically whether we should be too hard on agriculture. If they get a hold of a submission saying, hammer agriculture and it should be 0 methane, just like it's going to be 0 carbon, does that mean that the nets are going to say, nah, forget it, we're going to walk away? And, like strategically, should we actually be being really hard on methane or not?
That's a really good question. you don't know, but Peter and I know that we have some strong debates on this because Peter and I are in slightly different positions on it. So I appreciate you putting it as a question to me. The agriculture thing is really complicated. I mean, partly it's the main anchor of our economy. Partly, as I said, I think farmers have got a worse press than they deserve. And I think there's become entrenched positions. And my belief is we're all on this jolly steep learning curve. And some people are really resisting getting on it. But we mustn't sort of try and cut them off too much. But there are some people who know or should know and still don't get on it. And I'm sorry to say that fed farmers is one of those. I'm going to flick through to the end to illustrate this since we're talking about that.
Can I just say that coupled with methane is nitrous oxide, and nitrous oxide is 300 times more powerful than
Carbon dioxide.
So that if you are farming intensively, which is what they're doing with heaps of urea, then they're going to be making lots of nitrous oxide. So if they cut back the number of cows and farm more sustainably, or wrong word, regeneratively or something, then it is going to work. And the only trigger you can do that with is either dairy or, sheep. So they're linked.
They are linked. And I'll be with you in
Water comes in there too.
Yeah, that's
Because
right.
they're really stuffing that up.
Oh, look, you're absolutely right. And in a moment, I'm going to ask whether you want to let the questions keep rolling or whether we want to change mode. But I just want to pick up on the question. Okay, the Berg report. Berg is the Biological Emissions Reference Group. It's under the MPI, but it's got the players like Fonterra and Federated Farmers and the fertilizer industry and Dairy NZ. So and if you read here, it says the modelling indicates, this is one of 7, this is the 7th of their key findings in their report late last year, okay? It says overall biological emissions in the future could potentially be reduced between 10 and 21% by 2030 and 22 and 48% by 2050. The Zero Carbon Act is saying almost exactly the same. They're talking about a 10%, so the easier end of that range, and they're talking of 25 to 47%. So the Zero Carbon Amendment Bill is very much echoing what Berg has said. But here's what Federated Farmers say. Andrew Hoggard, who's the climate change spokesperson for Federated Farmers, just came out very recent. I'm sorry, I haven't put a date on that. It's in the last few weeks anyway. The science is clear, 10% by 2030 methane emissions reduction is only needed by 2050 to have no additional impact on global warming. This is from Federated Farmers, and I'm sorry, I'm sympathetic with farmers, but I'm not sympathetic with fed farmers. Have no additional impact. You remember that graph that I showed that it stays level? What they're saying is, oh, it's fine, it's way up here. Well, to me, it's like being in bed with 3 blankets on, okay? And you think, my God, it's warm, I'll throw a blanket off. And that's like cutting your stock numbers and bringing down the methane component of our warming. So then he goes on to say, oh, it's not founded in science, and yet they're members of the very organisation that has reported on it. Just this final thing, just this morning, Rod Oram had a great article in Newsroom. I really rate Rod Oram. And he basically said, he was talking about how the Irish have completely eclipsed where we're getting to on climate change responses in agriculture. He said, why have they been able to eclipse New Zealand? Because all the big players in New Zealand refuse to accept or take responsibility for what's going on. Not the individual farmers, but the organisation. Sorry, you've been waiting.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, since how we're on the subject of animal agriculture, and I do recognise myself, like, that compared to the rest of the world, we are a lot better at tending to our land in terms of agriculture, but I don't think that we can use that to just rest on our laurels and not admit that we're actually still part of the problem. Whether we choose to admit that or not, it's something that we have to realise that we are still part of the whole world. And if we are still condoning intensive dairy farming or even dairy farming at all, we're still part of that problem. You know, we're still putting nitrate into the water supply that's making our rivers undrinkable and unswimmable and causing all these diseases and sicknesses. Like, we're not exempt from this. And also the fact that because sea levels are rising and most of New Zealand, like a lot of towns are in coastal areas, will actually be, you know, kind of a weakness sometimes with New Zealand is the fact that we're so sort of separate from the rest of the world and kind of isolated in a way. So we think that all this big stuff that's happening isn't affecting us directly, but it's not yet. So I think that's something you have to keep in mind.
Thank you. Really, that's really good. I'm not going to talk about the sea level rise thing because I think that's a bit different to the zero carbon bill. It's related to it, getting it down. But I do want to talk about the idea that we're all personally part of the problem, and I agree totally with you. I think we've got, I'll be with you in a minute, Karen. I think we've got a transition zone. Well, I know we've got a transition zone we're in. And I think in New Zealand, one of the things we can do in New Zealand is actually lower our intake of red meat and dairy products so that what we buy here, and also resist the idea of importing any because they may come from even higher emissions sources. So that's one thing, is to lower our own contribution. But I think the other is that we want to encourage a global view of the dairy market and the red meat market, so that collectively we maximize minimize the footprint of it globally. Now, I've got a question at the back, but I just want to see how we're ticking along on. We're nearly at 6:30. I'm happy to keep going if you're happy to keep going, but I also don't want people to finish it and I thought we were finishing just after 7 and we haven't done any workshops. So what's the general feeling? Should we let this roll for another 5 minutes and then change mode?
Can you mention tourism, please?
I will, but I've got a question at the back first, yeah. Okay, thanks, John. Karen, you had a question.
Yes, just whether you think that what's proposed so far is sufficiently tackling fossil methane.
Sorry, as far as fossil methane?
Do you think it's sufficiently tackling fossil methane?
I'm sorry, I've got by the machine there.
Do you think fossil methane has been taken into account sufficiently so far in what's been proposed?
The question was, do I think fossil methane has been sufficiently taken into account? So the first thing is, let's be clear, fossil methane has to come down to zero or be part of the net zero by 2050 or 2030 if we persuade them it should be a shorter timeline. So it's not part of the biogenic methane cycle. I can't honestly answer whether it's been taken sufficient account of, because I think I've looked at it as part of a package. But I think we do have to be careful that we've got things like, are we going to allow prospecting licenses to go on for things that will then lead to it? The 8 Rivers hydrogen generation proposal last year in Taranaki was floated on the idea of generating hydrogen as an alternative fuel. But as I understand it, that was a byproduct of a fertilizer process that was going to, among other things, generate that. So yes, I think it's a good point. I don't know the actual answer to it. Shall we make this the final query now from John, and that is, what about tourism? Tourism's a real headache for New Zealand. In fact, both to New Zealand and going away from New Zealand. I mean, it's way up there as one of our biggest earners, and it's also one of our biggest parts of our carbon footprint. I personally think that New Zealand's big challenge is either to find a way of replacing tourism as an alternative or sort of economy, or an even bigger but better challenge would be to say, how can we come up with a really low carbon version of tourism? It's not easy, whether it involves boats, whether it involves offsets, whether it involves I don't know what, but I think that's one of the real challenges. It's a huge problem, and it's a bit of a paradox because it's a growth industry, and everybody who likes growth industries supports it. So I'm sorry, I don't have a magic bullet for you on that.
I didn't expect you would, but it needed to be said.
It does, you're quite right.
It's actually bigger than dairy now in terms of...
I think it might be actually, yeah.
We cut the tourist tax if they swim here.
Yeah, but the interesting, thank you, the interesting thing is, just a last word on that, when Scotland declared a climate emergency, the whole of Scotland, not long before Nelson did, a week after they declared it, they had before their parliament a decision whether to scrap the departure taxes on airports. And they decided that scrapping the departure taxes would encourage more flying, and that wasn't consistent with a climate emergency, so they did not scrap it. They were very unpopular with sectors of the industry because of it, but that showed, I think, quite clearly the sort of tip And ultimately, I don't know whether Nikki or Karen can comment, but it seems to me that it can't be long before councils, all the major reports and everything goes through council, have to have some sort of lens of climate emergency on it. I mean, are you in a position to comment on that now, or is that unfair?
Just to say that's something that we've been discussing.
Yeah. So it's in train, and I mean, it's all very fresh stuff for them too, so look forward to what comes there. Oh, Bruce.
Jet Zero do have as one of their options on their website the possibility of including international aviation and shipping as this should be included in the bill.
Oh, that's a very good point. So it's only onshore stuff that the bill addresses. Thank you. So I should have picked that up. It doesn't address, shipping or stuff that goes offshore.
So we should put that into our submissions then.
Well, you have to be very careful, because as soon as you connect it with the rest of the world, it becomes dramatically more complicated. I think maybe it should be there as a, hey, we ought to be thinking about this. I know there are a couple more questions. I'm going to stop there, if you don't mind, on the question front, because I want to just flick back for a little. Oh, what have I done there? We'll see what comes up. I've given my computer a hemorrhage, but we'll get there. Okay, you all you recognise that? We're nearly there. And there. So I could have played you a 2-minute YouTube clip. It's basically National and Labour people on climate talking about the submission. But what I suggest is that you go there yourself. If you Google, go to Parliament Zero Carbon Amendment Bill, you'll get into the right space. There are also a few copies of my PowerPoint slides lying around. You can take them there. And so this is a very quick take on preparing a submission. Okay, there are prompts on the website. You do it all through the website. Start there. There are prompts. Be very careful with your private details, because quite big sectors of it are in the public domain. So if you don't want stuff in the public, you have to put your name down in a private box. But if you write it in your main part of your submission, it'll be out in the public arena. You can upload documents. So rather than write, and you'll see the sort of places you can write, rather than do that, I encourage you to write it on your own computer. But they only accept a handful of file types. So there are the ways you can do it. You can either use the online form, which is quite limited, I'll show it to you, or you can prepare it, and I suggest you prepare it and cut and paste, or you can email it in. So that is the online form. And when you get there, it is, you navigate to www.parliament.nz. As I said, write it separately and cut and paste, and they basically, you've already given your personal contact details and stuff. We wish to make the following comments. We wish to make the following recommendations. So if you just want to do it simple and don't want to cover a lot of ground, then that's a good way to do it. But the other way is to write a fuller document, in which case you go through another path on the website and you can attach it to your submission. Okay. So what I've done here is I'm going to leave that up now. So for anybody that wants to write notes, work on your laptop, ask questions in a smaller group, there are some prompts, but I've also put around several copies of that expanded a bit. So on the tables and maybe where you're sitting, you'll find a couple of sheets stapled together. There's an expansion of that list. There's also the Green Party. Now, I'm not a member of the Green Party, okay, I'll be clear on that. But the Green Party, someone sent me a checklist the Green Party have done, and I thought it was quite good. It had like half a dozen things that the bill does well and half a dozen that we should ask them to do better. And you can look at that too. So it's a prompt there. I'm not saying do it. Yes, Ellie?
Sorry, is it possible that you could email this to us?
I can email the whole of this PDF of this presentation if you'd like. Okay, now, is there anybody that doesn't want, because we've got all your email addresses thanks to Eventbrite. Anybody that doesn't want me to email it to them? That's a bit of a rotten question, isn't it? Okay. What I suggest we now is, you can either stay sitting as you are if you like, but we've got picnic tables. We've got a table at the back there. Is it still up? Yes, it is. or you can rearrange, or you can say, hey, please come and talk to us. And could Bruce and Peter just stand up so everybody knows who else? You've met Jenny. This is Peter Ollerenshaw and Bruce Gilkison, who are also members of the ACE group. And so tap one of us on the shoulders and we'll do our best. But just bear in mind, I don't think I said this at the beginning, this may be the first event like this in the country. Now, I know other groups like the Greens and so on are doing circuits, but I'm not aware of anybody doing sort of like public workshops like this. I hope I'm wrong, because it'd be good if there were a whole lot more happening. But so we're in new territory too, and we're wondering, we're going to ask you at the end whether, you know, comments for how we can make it better, whether we should run more and that sort of thing. Okay, so.
Lindsay, would it be too much to ask you to say something really very quickly about the role of tree planting in this act? Was that too big?
The role of tree planting. Okay, thanks, Karen, I will. I'll do my best. Well, with a name like Wood, I should be able to give it a go, shouldn't I? Okay, probably the big picture is that New Zealand has lost about 70% of its afforestation. About almost half of that went in pre-European times, and the rest went in post-European times. Peter, we should get your slide out, shouldn't we? I have, yeah. Well, there we go. Can you talk to that?
I don't like that one. I like the next one.
Okay. I want the other one.
So
Do you want the pointer?
the top line is the total.
That's the little middle button second to the top.
Okay, so this top line is the total cumulative emissions. Okay, so along the bottom is years, so that's 1865 here to today, just short here. And this is the cumulative emissions over that time. So you can see the total's gone up. The green one is basically land clearance. So our cumulative emissions from land clearance are the massive burden that we've placed on the environment. The blue one here is biogenic methane. And the next one down, red, is CO2. So, and the yellow one is nitrous oxide. So, just looking at what our ruminant farming's done, it's had far more effect on our environment than what carbon dioxide has. That's really cool. A cumulative, you know. Well, this yellow one should actually be tacked onto the blue one. And you see, yeah. So
Okay, no, that's good. Do you want to expand on that, or? Because
well,
I've got a couple of other comments to make on trees.
I don't know whether we should be placing blame on things, but it's just, you know, if we reforest our land, look at, sorry. We reforest our land, you know, we're sort of replacing this thing up here, you know. And if we keep pastoral farming, it's this opportunity cost where we haven't got the land to put bloody trees on, just to soak up the carbon.
Thanks for that.
It's not just a sort of hit from the methane,
Cheers.
it's an opportunity cost as well.
Yeah. If I can just pick up a little bit on other things on trees. In the big picture, picking up on what Peter said, the broad rule of thumb is that dairy land is suitable for horticulture, and beef and sheep is suitable for forestry. So that's the broad shift that's expected. So if we get rid of dairy, it's not so likely to go into forestry, it's more likely to go into hort, which is not a bad thing, but there's a massive skill shortage. So if we're going to go down that path, we actually have to generate the people to do it. But the other thing then, looking at in timber, in terms of the impact of forestry, we've got what's sometimes called the wall of wood coming at us, and that is in the 90s they had all these places with plantations because of their then emissions trading scheme, and they're all coming to a point where they're due for harvesting. So what happens is if I'm sorry, we're jumping around a bit, but if we go back to that graph, the next one before that, that one, So if you look at the black, the LULUCF bit, that's the impact of forestry. We're going to be cutting down a lot of trees in the very near future. A huge amount. Now that's not all plantation, that includes all our native forests as well. But what's going to happen is we've got all these trees coming down, and so there's going to be a lowering of the trees' ability to soak up carbon. So our emissions balance is going to get worse. And the other thing that's tied with that, people involved with building regulations, is we need to find a better way of incorporating that into buildings, because that means it will then endure as a carbon store instead of going back into the air. So the wall of wood is coming at us. I personally think we should be talking to forestry people about saying, hey, don't mill it all at once, you just have to leave some of it standing and soaking up soaking up carbon dioxide. But it gets complicated. But planting trees, a mature tree roughly sequesters about 25 kilograms of carbon dioxide a year. So when I do a trip over to Germany and back, as I do from time to time, I need about 400 trees growing to soak up the emissions from that. It's pretty daunting.
Yeah, I just wonder if you could say a little bit about the other greenhouse gases, some of which are far more potent, like the nitrous oxide. For example, from rotting matter in our sewage ponds and our landfill tips, they're creating lots of non-methane gases, which are more potent. So
I'm really happy to talk about other gases, but I would say that they're all covered in the zero carbon bill by 2050. So they're not really contentious in that sense, except that we have to make sure we nail them. They're only contentious, I think, to the extent that diminishing intensive agriculture will help bring them down. If you want, what I'd suggest you do is, where is it? If you go and look at, oh, I'm sorry, I'm messing it up again. If you look at the slide that had that big swoop of methane, when you get it, that has some dotted lines on which shows the behavior of those gases a bit. There are some other gases like hydrofluorocarbons, which are in air conditioning systems, which are terrible. But they don't feature. But you talk to the air conditioning industry, and I was talking to someone the other day, said, I'm having to get out of dealing with air conditioning because the cost of the new products are so dear, and I have to buy this $5,000 machine to extract it properly from the cars and things like that. Okay, that's good. That's what has to happen. Are you happy if we leave this at this stage? Not at that. I'll get back to the slide I was on before. I'm sorry, you're getting used to this, aren't you? Jumping. Oh God. And that's so much for smart. I'll just go back to that one. So these lines here, you see up there it says, very quickly, this is from the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment, a report they did recently, to show the comparative behaviour of carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide. That's the methane trajectory, and their global temperature effects from a one-off emission. You know, I talked about a pulse of gas, so you put a squirt of gas in. If you put 1 ton of nitrous oxide, that's that curve, the yellow. 9 tons of methane, it's that curve, and nearly 300 tons of CO2, and it's the red one. So the point of that graph is that in a 100-year period, they all have the same effect. So when Jenny said nitrous oxide is about 300 times as bad as carbon dioxide, that's what she was talking about. Does that give you enough of a sense of that? Yeah. Okay. You've been wonderful, thank you, and hanging in there. Maybe everybody's... Well, just hang on. I've said about 7 times I'm going to stop, and I think people... Can I come and see you afterwards, John, rather than talk it through? Unless people say, yes, let's have more questions. Let's give people a chance to just think it through. There's on the table, I'm going to leave that other thing up for you with a list of topics. You'll find bits of paper around, 2 bits stapled together with some suggestions. You can read them, you can ask questions. If you want, we can come back and have more of this if you like. we're also, if I can just before, because I don't quite know how informal it's going to get and when people drift away, we're going to circulate an evaluation form, please, for you to complete. Among other things, we are seriously thinking of how many of these events we roll, maybe one a fortnight, one every 3 weeks, whether we do another of the zero carbon bill ones, or whether we go into areas like helping people plan, almost like this, but on a personal scale. If I'm going to get myself to carbon zero by 2030 or 2050, how can I plan that? And we thought we might run workshops on that and that sort of thing. So, okay, a few people saying yes, that's great. I don't know if does anybody else want to throw in any? Katrina, have I covered it?
I think you've done really well, Lindsay. I think the question of would another one of these be useful? I mean, not for people on the road, but I know 3 people that would love to come to it. So, I mean, that would be a good indicator. Do you think we should put another one of these on? Would we get another crowd, do you think? Or do you think we would? You'd like get the word
Yeah,
out?
thank you.
And would a different night or a Monday night or a Wednesday night? I know somebody who tonight would really like to.
Okay.
And a personal topic I want help with desperately.
The toilet's there.
This is the problem. Like, most of my mates, all right, are well off, retired, well educated. They know a lot of all of this, and they do absolutely nothing about it. So they're functional deniers. And yet they see themselves as being, and you know, a lot of us are like this. How do we get into people's heads at that level when they know a lot, they just don't do anything? What's the gap? And I'm supposed to know some of
I
it.
think that'd be a great workshop, Lindsay.
It would, actually, you're right, it'd be a wonderful.
I think it'd be great for a workshop.
I work away at them, but...
It's a huge topic. There are books on change management, there are books, and if I can just go back to one of the first slides, that Australian Securities Services slide, that basically is saying we probably need militia rule to make the conversion we have to do. In other words, we're not going to do it voluntarily, perhaps.
Just a reminder, in the mid-1970s with the oil crisis, I was working with the Canadian government and we were working on carbon footprints. Would you believe we thought we were going to save the world? The Canadian government poured hundreds of millions of dollars into insulating the nation, and on transport and on every sector was covered. But they thought that despite all that money, all the public servants and everybody else who was working on it, and commitment from industry, we had task forces and action groups.
We had Carlos Days.
It was still just like cruising along and not really getting like a martial law coming in. But the fun thing to talk about was, and the government said as well, we'll work as hard as we can with pouring all this money in. It's going to take one of 2 things, or both of them, to actually make it work. One is massive dollars, or is a magnitude more than we're putting in now, or a massive crisis. If there's a crisis, people will sort it out for themselves.
And maybe just there's a hard reality check in the. I'm going to flick through. Oh no, we've got it back again. There's a hard reality check in that oil crisis, and that is at that time, and this is one of the things with us being at the end of the world. You have to put up with this. There we go. Is that at the end of the world, there were oil tankers coming to New Zealand. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm wrecking this, aren't I? Oil tankers coming to New Zealand to deliver oil that were diverted to go somewhere else. Why? Because there were much bigger customers who said, we want that oil. So we just have to think, you know, we think, oh, we're a pretty secure economy. When it comes to that sort of thing, we've got no clout at all. So, okay, I won't flash through all these again. Thank you for your attention to that. If we change mode now, what I will do is I'll find that other slide with the topics up there. Are you happy to change mode now? Yeah, okay, that's good. Oh. Thank you, that wasn't expected, but it was very kind.